feel like everybody's right and everybody's wrong.
100%. Why is this important? Why are we even going here? He's helped a lot of guys. He's also not had success with a lot of guys.
Come in with a purpose, and they're very intentional with what they do and how they do it.
From the majors to the sandlot, baseball and softball share space in one place. Welcome to the farm system.
Fellas, and the ladies, welcome back to another episode of The Farm. We are back. Tay, we haven't had you on the pod in a while.
It's been a minute.
You know what I'm saying?
Been a minute.
But I was having a conversation. God, your camera angle looks so clean, Taylor. If you ain't watching the video version this time, it's on you because Taylor looks sparkling. I had to set up the little with the lens on that one. You know what I'm saying? Sparkling. I was having a thought / a conversation this morning, and I was like, then I walked in and I was like, man, this would be a good conversation for you and I to have. Definitely best friend talk that you and I would have quite a bit, especially on like a concept like this. So I was thinking about aging. Okay, you know what I'm saying? We're getting older.
Right in there.
Yep, we're getting older. But one of the things I thought was pretty interesting and maybe some perspective. I think that would be an interesting convo for us. One of the things the thought I had was aging is so interesting because I feel like it adds, well, it can, but for me, it has added color to my world. You know, like perspective where one of the benefits that we have is from talking with, we have obviously a lot of younger athletes that, you know, come and train. Obviously, 10 years all the way up. But one of the things, obviously as well, like most of the time, I'm working with a lot of our college athletes, things like that as well. And so a lot of times when I'm talking to them, I'm getting a glimpse of their reality, right? Of like where they're at in their life. And it's so interesting because, now that we're starting to get on not the other side, but like, obviously we're in a place where, we're getting the mentor, we're getting the pour into all those other things. And also we have a little bit of life experience. We're on as my brother used this phrase the other day, is we're on the third floor of this thing. Mm-hmm. You know what I'm saying? So we're on the third floor of this thing. So as you get to the different floors, I think that there's so much perspective that, you get, obviously from years of, and it's kind of in the background of it's happening. And you look back, like I said, I was getting glimpses of being like, so I've been thinking back, like when I was 19, when I was 20, when I was in like how different my perspective was of the world. And then also how much, and for me personally, how much color was missing in my life that, God added dramatically as I continued to not only like heal, but also to just mature, like a lot of other things that come with age. So I was interested in that too, just from like your perspective kind of with that as well. Do you, I guess, first off, do you connect with that statement? And then two, what's your take?
Well, off the bat, let's make this very clear to our listeners. We had very different college experiences. Okay.
Dramatic.
Sure, yeah, dramatic difference there. You were always on a sports team and I was in a sorority. So right off the bat, very different.
Yeah.
However, we want to define color.
Yeah.
That sentence, I feel like my college experience had plenty of it. Taste the rainbow. However, I definitely, as we have gotten older, and we're on the third floor, as you'd say, there's a lot of things that are certainly more clear to me. But I also wouldn't change anything either. Yeah. I think everything kind of took its course in a reason, and God's plans were divine.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I think would you say also, I think also the perspective, like I keep saying too, right? Obviously if I had the perspective that I have now, even like, that's why I'm also looking forward, shout out to our vlog we got coming, but about, even just playing, like how different my perspective is, just where I'm at in my life and like just the security that comes along with it and like identity not being attached, like how different that is. And we've had some podcasts where we talked about some of those things, but I just think you bring that over to your life, I'm thinking about perspective as well of not only athletes that we currently have that could be listening that obviously like I think like pouring into them and some of that perspective and maybe helping them see a little bit different perspective or helping them. Because for me, and again, I know a lot of this is tied to my faith, but like so much freedom, right? Like freedom and like, it's funny. I actually had this conversation. I think you'll think this is funny, just because it's like mental health space. Is I almost took my. I think if there's one thing I could say that I battle generally is like anxiety. Like I'll have anxiety, and like generationally, kind of through my family, like we all had pretty high anxiety. So I feel like I've, gotten to beat her down a little bit, I guess, beat her back a little bit, just through my life experience. But also too, with that being said, this morning, when I was driving, like I felt like my anxiety like creeping just over something that whatever, just some random things that it just. But I was able to almost like speak to it like I was able to speak to it like separate from me, if that makes sense, right? Like I was speaking to my anxiety, right? Like calm down, like like almost like okay, like just sit over here for a second and let the grown people talk. like it was like that's kind of how it felt. Was like calm down. You're like, I know that you're just those are just the emotions. Like just get over to the side. Like you're getting worked over. Like there's this extra emotion here that doesn't need to be here. When in reality, like it's okay. And so I just think about that all the time. It's just like how much of that as well is just obviously like resources, tools / strategies, right, that I've learned over the years, like how to like get better to know myself and understanding like those things like over time. But what would you say when you, from your 20s to now, I know we just got out of the 20s, right? But what would you say to were like some major takeaways like from your 20s that like kind of helped you, like you said, just really kind of like settle into where you are now? And because you changed a lot, I did too, right? Like 20s were a time. I mean, 10 years, right? It's a good amount of time. But just thinking about that, right? Like, what would you say in general, like within your 20s, like some big things that just really helped, perspectives that you kind of changed that you think really help you now?
Gosh, so many. So for the listeners as well, I also entered college at 18. So I started that journey, fresh adult, and explored every region there was to explore. Came in, even though I joined a sorority, definitely still played sports, definitely may or may not have gotten the sporty award 3 years in a row. That's fine.
Yep.
But to kind of go back to what you were saying about identity, I think a big part of that was me not being ready to let sports go yet, even though it wasn't going to be at a mass scale, right? It was in no, giant arena. It wasn't for a bunch of fans, but I had always been an athlete, around athletes, coming from a family of coaches. So that to me was my only connection back into sports. I will say around my junior year, as I was in my earlier 20s, I did start to find myself in other areas where I could start forming a new identity that was no longer with athletes, no longer with athletics. Now, mind you, I also started motivational speaking around this time. I started motivational speaking to sports teams, to realtors, to schools, to as many places as I could. And so that kind of was my new thing, right? However, within that journey, there was still a lot of struggle in being authentically myself. And I think my biggest takeaway throughout my 20s would probably be that. If I would have, we can call it courage, we can call it boldness, we can call it whatever we want to. But I think within that time frame, there was a lot of hesitation for me in being truly authentic and truly myself. And had I, got to that route a little bit quicker, that would have been nice. But also, again, everything happened.
And I think just interesting because I while your story is your story and won't be everybody else's story, of course, right?
For
But I
sure.
also, too, at the same time, I think obviously it pretty normal in the sense of a lot of people are like figuring out who they are in their
Totally.
20s, right? And like your world is changing a lot.
Especially in college.
Yeah, college, you got, again, you might have, maybe you moved away, maybe you took other jobs. Like, I mean, I had like multiple career changes.
yeah.
And I would say like career were like, I could have made all of those careers and like was
Sure.
on my path to do certain things. And like, it just, kind of moved different directions and a lot changed, right? And a lot more clarity, going into my 30s for sure. But one of the things I was going to bring up is like, while your story is your story, I think that's a common thing that, especially in your 20s, right? Some people it might be earlier in the 20s. Some people might be like late. Maybe they're still even too, like in your 30s where you're still struggling with some of those things of like becoming like who you are or, what that looks like. I know, again, I feel like the conversation would be really interesting because I feel like people struggle with some of the same things, like obviously uniquely within your situation, right? Within, your story. I understand from a family perspective and I understand, like I know, again, like from that walk, right? I get all of those, but also too, when you look at it from a space of struggle in general, like that, when people have problems like being who they are, right? And like also walking in like what those things are, right? And like the courage, like what is also like for you, what did you feel like was a holdup in the sense of what did you need the courage to face when it comes to like what were you tied to, like the underlying meaning, like yes, my family might think these other things, right? And we can go, obviously, again, like your whole what, just like, from sexuality standpoint, all those things, like for sure. But there's, I think, more of a root too as well, being like, we're all in some way attached to what somebody else might think,
For sure.
right? Of me being me. You get what I'm saying? And while their story, and again, my story is not your story, I also identify with the whole thing of being like, again, I might be judged for me being me. So what was like that for you of like, what helped you break through that barrier of like, again, the courage part of
Sure.
I'm going to be me.
Yeah. Well, I think it comes, and kind of like you said, like we can all share the common reality of taking on a new title, taking on a label,
Yeah.
right? And society now, we hate labels, we hate titles, we hate
Yeah.
naming things what they are, and that was a big piece of it for me, and a big piece of it, 1000% was definitely what people would think, in very specific circles, and whatever that looked like was a big holdback. And I think the big push was, honestly, I had really supportive friends. I had a great, amazing group of people around me. I lived with girls that were in my sorority. We had, our own little Greek row, if you will. But I lived around and I was with a lot of really supportive people in my life in the day to day. I didn't live at home. I lived across the street from campus, which made my environment a lot more encouraging. I had a lot more freedom, a lot of the things that you just finally start to get for a lot of us when you go away to college. And even though I was still in the state, I was still away from home, which was nice. And so with that, honestly, my friends got me through a lot. I mean, you being one of them, even though you were always in a different state.
I know.
But, I had a really solid group, and me being able to be honest with them, even though they already knew a lot of my truths,
Yeah.
just spending the day to day with me,
Yeah.
to have that encouragement was a big kick in the right direction.
Yeah. 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 No, I think that's a kind of the same thing too of, I think definitely like you're saying too, being around people that are also going through that journey, and also to, especially when, if you can get around mentors, and mentor also too, I think a lot of time we always think older, which a lot of times could be, but also too, like when you have friends and things like that are very okay, obviously, with being them, that also really helps throughout that period. And I know, like you said, for me, I think also one of the things that was kind of interesting, like you said, I was always in like a different state, or I felt like I kept getting the opportunity to reinvent myself. Mm-hmm. You know, because you go somewhere else, it's like different group of friends,
New
different
team,
environment,
new
new
coaches.
team, new coaches, and I got to do that multiple times, and so it's like, you know, one of the things I think when people even transfer and go to other schools, right, in which I did, but you know, mine were not necessarily like, oh, I'm not playing or something, I'm going to go to this other school or whatever, but I think that where that can be a positive thing is like sometimes you're just like in a certain environment, they put you in a box, right, and like this is who you were in that box, and then rightfully so, like you might have done some things to like lose some trust in that environment, or you've made some mistakes or doing other things, and people are keeping that in mind and other things, but it might be holding you back from like maybe you've grown from that spot or whatever, right?
Yeah. And
so I do think sometimes like a change in scenery, because I know a lot of times like I always bring up like that Adam Sandler skit where he's like in Saturday Night Live years ago, a long time ago, I'm aging myself now, but is that he did the skit where he's like, if you're not happy like whatever city like in the United States, you're also not going to be happy in Paris, right? Like
Right.
And it's just like, again, like it's going to follow you, comes with you. It's not like purely the environment, but I do think your environment obviously has an impact and like how you interact. And I think, you know, obviously with that, right, your friend groups, the people that you're around, like then, you know, again, what you're doing, your inputs, right? Like what you're doing every day has a big impact on also within all that. And I do think that like changing environment sometimes, especially when you've grown out of an environment and that environment no longer serves you, it can be good to move to a different place and like, you know, reinvent and surround yourself with different people, or maybe like where you want to go, or, you know, etc. But I was just thinking about that with, just like in my own life, just how, when I say like added color, as I felt like my perspective was as I was younger, my life was like very much more like a shallow view. Because I think even from my perspective too, like it was deep for the environment that I was in. Like I was deep in a shallow pond. Mm-hmm. You know what I'm saying? And then once you break out of that shallow pond and you get into some different, that water runs to this, that water runs to that, you know, and then all of a sudden you're in the ocean. It's like, oh, we can get, you know, we're not in the pond no more.
Yeah, right.
This can get as deep as, you know, as deep as deep gets, you know, and when your life is only that pond, because one thing I didn't have, and like we talked about, it's like, oh, I was in all these different cities and all this stuff. When I was growing up, that was not the case. Mm-hmm. When I was growing up, I did not. I think I went to two places. I went to Idaho one time and like Southern California.
Right.
And that was it. Like 2 trips, or maybe I went to Southern California, like, or I guess also San Jose. So like, yeah, I mean, just a couple trips throughout my entire life, like childhood, right? I just didn't travel very much at all. So like, again, very shallow pond. And then also too, where you know my family from that same sense is even like spectrum of, or I would say bandwidth, like the bandwidth in which my family like interacted. We had a lot of shallow, which again, we've deepened in like all these other things, but I think it's just interesting from that same sense as like my world was very shallow, just because it kind of felt like I was like in a pond, and I felt deep in that pond, but like there is, you know, there's just different depths of like color that just come in, which I think is also, I think the encouragement there as well. I think it's always interesting and hard to share a worldview, but like we try. Right, or a perspective that we're currently having, because again, like until you like experience it, like I was even, I think I brought up to, I think it was Jarrell the other day when I was saying like, you know how we'll describe like an out of body experience, but if you've never had an out of body experience and then trying to describe one to somebody, it's just weird to think, because you feel your first person, right? You feel like you're conscious here right now, right? But when you can, you know, when you kind of start seeing yourself from higher levels or different angles and perspective, it can provide you a ton of perspective rather than obviously what you're looking at it from like right here, right? When I can get an angle, when I can get a higher perspective and see like the bigger thing that's going on and not get so sucked up into my world and all that stuff, it just adds a lot of depth. I think if anything, I think you'd connect with this a lot too as well, is a world that's about you is pretty shallow, you know, like, and not shallow in the like sense of like an attack. It's just like, hey, like not that you're not important, like you are, like, and you're unique and like all those other things, but also too, like when you get out of you and you get up and you start actually looking around and you see the environment, and then also see like our purpose isn't us. You know, so when we get up and we actually start looking out and get involved and like start like, you know, interacting and being part of a community and like doing all those other things, like your world just opens up so much more. And like, again, like color all of a sudden starts coming in, where I felt like before, like my world was more like black and white, if I could describe it. And, you know, that kind of perspective is kind of like how I feel from there. You connect with that? Like what did that kind of look like for you? Like as you started, I know that you've always been like more in communities and things like that as well. But like, obviously I also feel like your perspective, you know, like we talked about, very different college experiences, and like you also changed a lot. Which also I think, a side note here, I think also speaks a lot to our friendship, is that, you know, again, both of us drastically changed in our 20s. And a lot of people like grow apart. And I did with a lot of friends and stuff I had. I know, same for you, like a lot of those other things. And like me and you always kind of stayed like going that same way. So, you know, for that, bringing it back to thing is like, you know, what did that look like for, or feel like to you, of like those perspective shifts, you know, throughout your 20s?
I think...
And again, I know you were always more involved in groups and you're extroverted.
Yeah. That's where I was going to go. I don't think I ever felt like the world was about me. I don't think I ever had that reality, and maybe to a fault. I think that, you know, and again, like you said, you know, from a very young age, I was, you know, volunteering or serving in some capacity. My aunt was always very particular that my cousins and I get out into the community and, you know, give, whether it be in church or sports or my cousin's Girl Scouts, whatever that looked like. And that was something that, you know, very quickly I knew that I enjoyed. And I think, again, another place where I kind of identified myself as a giver and as a servant and as a volunteer in any capacity. I think that's probably the most congruent thing in my life, is that I've always liked those things. I think when I've fallen out of those spaces is when my thinking gets a little bit more black and white. So I could say, you know, in that sense, I can definitely resonate with that. I think that
well, and I guess maybe if I can give a little bit more context, is just from like watching your life, is, you know, for example, like I know that you've always been in these communities and like more of like a place of like service or things like that, you know, but also too, in the sense of again, me and you had different like storylines, but I know that also, you know, along with that of being, how do I describe that? Like more of you became more like you were involved and then you got like organized, if that makes sense. You get what I'm saying? Like, it's like, okay, yeah, I've done those things, but all of a sudden, it was a different, you know, like it wasn't just like, oh, I'm kind of involved. Like, no, like you got organized within that. And obviously some of that was work related, right? Along with it, right? For sure. But I see those as like different chapters, like in your book, like comparatively, obviously, to like college, right? And that's what I mean. Like, for example, like we're in college, and again, just to speak blatantly here, right, on the same side of this, like I was like locked in. Like, I think why it was like me and my world was because like I was an athlete, like where in my mindset it was like everything was about me training, getting my body where it needs to go, doing my job to get, like, you know what I'm saying? Like I didn't have this like, you know, normal college experience that people would talk about. Like I've been to very little parties in college, you know, all the things. Like, again, when I was there, I probably didn't want to be there. Like I was very, you know, tunnel visioned, right?
Yeah.
Taylor was not. Okay. Taylor went a different route, right?
Literally the opposite.
Yeah. Most of the parties I went to was because of Taylor.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. But I say all that to say is, like, again, when you were doing all of those things, and it wasn't that you didn't have, you know, Giving Heart at that time or all these other things, it's just like a deepening and also being like, okay, like no, like I want to serve to a different capacity and that capacity shift. And that's what I kind of mean more like in that same way as being like, for sure, like you had always been open. I remember us talking about that, right? It was like when I was on my tunnel vision standpoint, I remember saying like, girl, you want to save the world. Like I'm just, I'm trying to be an MLB baseball player. Like, you know what I'm saying? I'm just trying to be a big league. Like my world was very stream, like I had tunnel visioned.
Yeah.
I was like,
No.
yeah,
even to that, let me just share a quick snippet here. And I remember this very vividly because I think I was like, almost was going to cut you off for 24 hours after this. Naturally, like every other weekend, I was going to go to a party, to a gathering with some other individuals, some colleagues, some peers. And Joey had the audacity to ask me, what did I have to celebrate? And I was like, Saturday. It's a Saturday night. That's what I'm celebrating. And in that moment is when I knew that we were living very different lives. Yes, we were in very different places.
You just shoved me back into a mindset.
I remember. And I want everyone to know I went out that night and had a great time. So I definitely celebrated life.
Yeah, no, I remember again where I was, and again, still part of like different things of
we had different intentions at that time.
And also too, I mean, again, like that's the mindset I had to have.
For sure.
Right? Like you're again, people forget obviously with that, right? Like not you, but I'm saying like in general, right? Like one thing that we do, because I think this what leads to some of these like just not connecting with the expectations that we put on our kids and not understanding. Like you look at the numbers, how many kids actually play in college, and it's so low comparatively. Like don't get me wrong, like if you get in the right environments, all these other things, the guy's serious, like blah blah blah, all this stuff, like there's a lot of places to play. But if you want to go play at a really high level in baseball, those numbers are insane. I mean, we're talking about like 0.5% within 0.5%. When we're talking about like, especially we start getting like major leagues, drafted, all these things, division ones.
Totally.
Power 5 division ones within all of that. Like, and I've given percentages before of like how insane that is. Like 99% of everyone playing on your kid's team right now most likely will not make it, including your kid.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? So when we put these crazy expectations and we don't understand, we're like, yeah, but my kid's the 1%. No. Your kid most likely is in the 99%. Well,
and I think even speaking to that contrast, I think my experience and your experience 100% speak to what both paths can get you. Yeah. Was I awarded? Did I get different accolades from different organizations? Yeah. And did I do plenty of things? 100%. And you did the same thing. Yeah. However, different goals, different paths.
For sure.
If my goals were your goals, I wouldn't have gotten there. If your goals were my goals, you wouldn't have gotten there.
Exactly. Yeah. And again, also too, like, again, that's what I wanted to do with my life, right? Like that it was been a passion of mine since I was a little boy. You know what I'm saying? So and then when you're getting that close, and then also too, being able to see where I needed to get to and what I needed to do, I knew for me, even people that had the same goals of me, we would have had to do different things to get there because we started at different places. I also too, my family didn't have money. You know what I'm saying? I needed scholarship money. Like I needed my grades to be high. I needed to be locked in because that was the only way I was able to do what I was able to do, right? And so, and also, again, like mindset, I remember like at that time was, I think I was also quoting, I had heard that quote from, it was either, I think it was like Ludacris or Tyrese or something like that, where he was just talking about like people out partying every weekend, right? It's like you're going into your week just trying to get to Friday so that I can go and party and escape my Monday through Friday, right? And then he basically brought the perspective of like, what are we celebrating? Right? Like getting through the week, like what are we celebrating? Like we didn't even get anything done. We didn't achieve any, like, you know what I'm saying? We didn't make any progress. We just battled and did the mediocre to get through Monday through Friday so that we can go party on the weekends. And also too, at the time, a lot of my teammates, like I was just telling the story the other day, when I was in junior college, like, again, of course, like one of my first weekends there, they threw a party, right? Mm-hmm. So I went to the first party with our team, all the stuff in college, great. Drank a little bit, walked home, right? And I remember going like, and even when I used to tell you that I'd be sitting at the party and I'd be like, what am I doing here? Like, what's the point of this? Like, for us to sit around and talk, like I'm not like in my head, it's like I'm not achieving anything. Like this time, like I could be reading, I could be doing all these other things. Like, I didn't see as much value in it at the time, which there's faults in that thinking, but it aligned with that alignment didn't line up to where I wanted to go, right? Me going out and my teammates wanted to party every weekend. And I also wasn't very liked on a lot of my teams because I wouldn't party. Like I wouldn't go out and party. Like I'd rather go home and read. Like I'd rather go home and run sprints or work out or do other things, right? And but also, within that mindset, and also too, I think it was even worse because especially when I'd first get on teams, a lot of times I wasn't the best player on the team. Especially wasn't in junior college or, most of the teams I played on at that level. Once I got into college, like I rarely was,
right?
Maybe my last year or something like that, I was like one of the better players or something.
Right.
But so I had that mentality even when it wasn't like I was the superstar doing that. It's a lot easier, right? They're like, oh yeah, that guy's the man, blah, blah, blah. It's like, no, I'm the backup and still had that mentality.
Right.
And so when, that mindset for me, I was on the same side of that, right? It's like, and I still kind of operate that like right now. It could be Saturday. It's Monday to me. Like it could be, any day of the week. It could be, whatever. Like I remember being in college and being like Christmas Day and being like, I want to go hit. I want to go work out. Like I'm getting my work in still. Like I'm sure. Mindset. Like I'd like, and again, it's not like something I was like forcing myself to do. Like I need to go work. It's just like, I felt like I was getting worse, like by not training today, and so like that was like my mindset. And again, to achieve those things, and again, to cover the ground that I needed to cover.
Sure. Because
I was behind, like, comparatively to that percentage that I was chasing down. You get what I'm saying? Like I was ahead of 99% of people, right? Again, but that's not who I was competing with. I was competing with the best in the world, and I knew where I was, and I'm like, like I got to work. That's the only way, like I would ever catch up. And so I think that was just an interesting thing for me. Like at that time, is again, like you said, is just like different mindsets of like why. Like there would be times I come home and I go out with you, but like I said, it was like those are like the only times I'd go out is because I again wanted to I was hanging out with you, and also too, it's not like I was super serious all the time. Like I did have my good carefree all the stuff, but at the time like I'm not going to go out like multiple weekends in a row or
sure
do all those other things because for me again that would be leading me away from my goal. Right. And so anyway, so I think that it's just funny because in that time, right, because how altering and how different of a perspective of that same period of in life like that we were, but also at the same time, I think like what I was saying earlier, how that speaks to while we were chasing down radically different things and in different places, like how at the same time there was obviously so much overlap and how the contrast was also very yin and yang to me, because I did need to be more social. I did need to not isolate so much. I did need, there was a lot of growing I needed to have from there, just like from a personal, like, standpoint too. So, I think that's definitely interesting. What do you feel like? What do you feel like? Because this is the other thing. Then you drastically got out of that space. Now, if I was trying, I think it's probably more the opposite. I mean, don't get me wrong. Like I know that. I think it's just it generally like if you were at a party, like I'd kind of be like, oh, okay, Tay. Like it would be like very very off to me. What felt like what shifted? I mean, that for you. I mean, obviously college, right? But like.
Yeah.
Still though, I would say both of us, right? Even when I first came back when we were, during COVID and all that stuff, like for, that kind of shifted, we kind of shifted from those spaces. Like what do you feel like that was for you? And like, what was that shift for you? Because even too good, we could say when I came in town, all that would have been still super dialed down.
Oh yeah.
From what? Yeah. So what was that kind of shift you felt like maybe for you?
I really think. I really think just hearing all the horror stories, being in the field that I was in the last 6 years or so. I my last semester of college, I had started working at a women and children's rehab facility that was residential.
Yeah.
And so naturally, you could imagine the things I heard there. Slowly, as my college career ended, I started managing a women's sober living house.
Yeah.
So I was an in-house manager living with 11 women max at a time. And by all means, that was a revolving door. So that would change day to day. And
First off, if this was not the scenario of a sober living house, if it was just 11 women in one house, period,
yeah,
that would, that's already,
right.
What I'm saying?
Yeah.
but girl,
Exactly.
God bless your heart.
Yeah. So rough times, but again, wouldn't trade that experience for the world either.
No, yeah, you reference it a lot. I know it was a big growing time.
Totally. And I'm still very tight with the guy who owns those houses now.
Yeah.
He owns like 5 houses and
Yeah.
does some really cool stuff in the community. But really, I think I just started to really mesh myself into so much of the mental health space. And when you hear those stories all the time and you hear of people really taking their life in 17 different directions, you really have to be a unique individual to want to go and drink.
Yeah.
And don't get me wrong, I know plenty of therapists that go out on the weekend and live their best life.
Yeah.
And then they come back Monday and start documentation.
Yeah.
So I mean, by all means, like those people are out there, and we all have our own ways of living. But that just didn't feed my soul anymore. And I think one of the bigger things too was that I grew a greater curiosity in the mindset behind not doing certain things. I didn't want to tell people to do one thing that I was doing all the time. So I'll come right out and say, like, I'm not in any recovery from substances. I for some reason, I was the chosen one in my batch of friends that didn't get addicted to substances.
Yeah.
However, I would say I've, been in a long-term life recovery journey from all the addicts in my life. But with that, I still did a 90 and 90. I still went to 90 meetings in 90 days because I wanted to understand. And when I was living in the women's sober living house, I would lead meetings and I would sit down and chat with the ladies and see what their biggest struggles were at that time. People that weren't able to see their kids, people that were spending their cancer fund on gambling. And you start to really get into these people's lives.
Sure.
And the more you start to learn about people and their struggles and what their life is like, again, it just gives you different convictions. And I think that I talked to enough people, saved enough seats, sat in enough seats to hear all that I needed to hear.
Well, and I think it's an interesting thing that you talk about too, is because I also think it's so interesting when we have like our journeys, right? Like our journeys create our perspectives, right? Like it's inputs, obviously major inputs, and then it helps us obviously how we perceive the world, or how, and I think along with that, right? Like when you can get in this world of, I think very opposite. What I mean by this, and let me give you two different contrasts. When you're in the normal parts of society and you're looking on Instagram and you're looking at highlight reels, comparatively to you being in that environment and seeing the real and seeing what people have struggled with, and like you, again, like we've talked about, CEOs.
Oh yeah.
I mean,
doctors,
nurses,
veterinarians,
all
pilots.
Yes, right. All these people that the society would perceive as successful, and they had all these things and this money and all this other stuff. And then you're not seeing the Instagram. You're seeing their real life, what they really struggle with, the stuff that doesn't go on Instagram, the good, bad, ugly, right? Mostly, no, not the goods, right? Like, really just like where you're at, like, and having that perspective is, I think a lot of us have been developed our perspective off of the other input,
For sure.
which is looking at people's highlight reels on social media, which then shapes my world very different. And I know how much it impacted your life because it's also impacted my life through you from the perspectives and things that you also share with me. And that's also why, even in house, right? Like when I've, the initiative we started towards the end of last year, we're about to do our second one. We messed up on January, right? But is for us to serve as a staff, right? Because even though with it, right, is like, first off, it's not a lot of time, for us throughout a month. Second on top of that is too, is like, I understand even, with that is like seeing the realities, right? And also, and then also two people want to blind their eyes to it. Like that's not happening or like that's not a real thing, but in reality, these people are struggling with these things. And
or even the opposite lens of that where people think they're the only one.
Yeah.
And that's what keeps us in the
100%
dark more times than any, especially
because I should have it together.
Performers.
I should have it together. Look on social media. Everybody else has got it together.
I'm a high performer. I have to do this. I have to do that. When in reality, there's millions, trillions of high performers out there that have very deep struggles.
Yeah. Well, and also I think one of the things I talk about, I've talked to you about this, is one of the things that made me such a high performer was the fuel source that was fueling me. Again, like that was, I was addicted to not substances, right? I was addicted to the same thing, like, and that's where like it that connection for me was like, again, like, and why I also have so much empathy on the other side is like I found a different avenue, which society deems as better, right? Because it is less impactful, I guess. Again, like there obviously is a difference between like what I was doing in sport and training and all that stuff, and obviously like substance abuse and like draining people's bank accounts and stealing from people and like all these other things, right? Like yes, there is a difference in world, but also too, I identify and can empathize and have compassion because while I found a different avenue in my circumstances and how I was growing up and how I was raised and all these other things, it pushed me more towards sports, and I had an avenue to do that when I happened to be talented and like could take that somewhere. But again, like what if I was just a terrible athlete? What if I was whatever? Like, would that have been an avenue that I could have gone and like where my life would have went, yada, yada, yada. Yeah. But I think also, with that as well is just like you now, nowhere near been around as many of those storylines, but also to have had the ability to be closer, especially with the church and some of those things with like people that's what I really liked about, I think, also being around at the church is kind of similar of how I get to see a lot of, at least in our groups, right, where I've had a lot of people very open with what they're really struggling with and what's going on in their life. And so because of that, we could actually have a real conversation. For sure. And not this facade Instagram. Oh, how are you? Everything's good, man. Blah, 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 blah. And it's just like, the day to day, there is tough days. Like I have, like there's, and I think that's the same thing too, as well. It's like on social media, like, yeah, just like that's not what you're promoting. You know what I'm saying? You're not promoting like a lot of, unless you like want the attention, right? Which a lot of people, like sure, again, like that could happen. But in general, most people are posting their highlight tapes when you see stuff on social media. Yeah. And you're not having those real conversations. And I think it also comes off as like, oh, like those are like darker or harder conversations. And for me, it's like, no, like they're real conversations. Like you're like if anything, when you actually get through the other side, it's actually when you get through, like, yes, there's some tough points, there's some things that, for sure, real feelings that we have to talk about, like, real traumas that we have to process, real, those other things. But again, rather than having like, I struggle, and I struggle with like just surface level conversation. Oh, how are the kids? Or blah 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 blah. Right. I want to get to like, let's talk about something that's real, and again, it doesn't mean that it has to be something to struggle, but like, like deeper conversations about experiences and like what people have learned and like like a real story. Like nobody goes and watches, imagine if you turned on a movie and nothing was happening. Like it was like how society makes it out to be, like everything's cool, nothing's going, like nothing's wrong, but nothing's exciting at the same time. It's just like you're just going through and like how everybody kind of like paints it, and then they have these little blimps of like, oh, this cool thing really happened. But in reality, like the journey is the story, right? There is a fall, there is, the comeback. There is the, like when you look at the storyline, like that's what makes it so exciting if you embrace it rather than trying to hide all these pieces underneath the rug and make your life look all these other things. Is just being like, like being more, the authenticity and also being along for the journey is like the most exciting part.
Yeah. Well, I think that's one of the bigger benefits of being a part of a group of any kind, whether it be a church group, a Bible group, a therapy group, FCAs, whatever your cohort is. But there's so much power in speaking things out loud with other people.
Yep.
And what you leave with after those conversations. Even if you sit in the group and say nothing at all for the hour.
Yeah.
I've done that plenty of times.
We've had plenty of people. I mean,
plenty.
I haven't sat in many groups and not said nothing. You know what I'm saying? But I've definitely had groups where we've had people that literally don't talk the whole time, and they'll come up to me at the end and they'll be like, "Yo, like,
yes,
that was so helpful for me," like all these other things, and like that happens a lot. And then also I notice when people don't say anything, but they come back every week over and over. I'm like, well, they're getting something. You know what I'm saying? Like,
getting something.
Yeah, they're getting something, right? And then we start talking, and they're like, yeah, like this has really helped me, and like, again, like you said, there's plenty of people that go to groups and like literally don't talk.
Yeah,
and
that's totally fine. I still encourage those people to show up. I don't like, you don't need to talk, just participate. And if you sitting there in the circle, if that's what participating looks like to you, do it every
especially at
week.
This stage.
100%. And when you feel called to speak up and share, take it.
Yeah, I've had people like that, like just like that too. Again, some of those people that sat in the group didn't say anything, and then all of a sudden, a year later, 6 months later, whatever, 2 years later, that person's leading a group or they're speaking now in the group, and I'm like, and then now there's a new person in the group, and I'm like, oh, like you don't know that this guy sitting next to me was worse. Like what didn't talk for months, or whatever, right? You just haven't talked for a couple weeks or something, It's like the guy sitting next to me, you would have no idea, but that's where they came from,
Yeah.
And I think that's just, it's so powerful, like just fellowship in general, and also obviously just community. But I do think it's important, which I know that obviously you guys, because for example, if y'all are all in the group and then we're still acting like this is Instagram, quote unquote, right? Where we're not being authentic, we're not being vulnerable, we're not doing these other things, right? Like, I think that's the other reason, like, why I've had so much great experiences in groups is the groups that I've been in have been very like authentic and vulnerable, and like I'm also willing to be authentic and vulnerable. So that gives the group also permission. Like I'll intentionally, a lot of times when I'm leading groups, I'll intentionally share, okay, like I'm going to share something when I can feel the group's not being vulnerable or they're being scared. I'm like, okay, I'm going to share something that's vulnerable for me. And then all of a sudden the group opens up and everybody starts sharing all these things. And it's like, oh, actually this was my mom and this was my brother and I've actually been struggling with, and then all of a sudden all these things come out, because to them, they might view, especially to, we talk about this a lot. People might view me now. It's like, oh, like CEO has his own business, all these things. Like a lot of people, especially in these community groups, especially church groups, stuff like that, they could be like how they perceive my relationship with God being like, I have all my things together. Right. And I'm like, let me break that. Like, I'm in journey, I'm in process too. I'm in learning, I'm becoming, what I'm saying? I might be in a different season and a different, whatever. And also too, I didn't come up with your exact circumstances. I had other avenues. I did other things. And like, I recognize not only that privilege, but also too, on top of that, like that opportunity, yes, I worked for, and I did these other things and made choices and X, Y, and Z, but just as easily, I understand that, I've seen and experienced enough people and have people in my life where one event, one thing, like you take a step to the left and like your whole life, like things could really change. So I think the compassion part of that and empathy is like a sense where a lot of our groups become very helpful in learning. And I think, you speak to this a lot even too when we talk about like therapists and all of these things, is that sometimes people do go, okay, you know what, I'm gonna take your advice, Tay. I'm going to the group. I'm going to go do this other thing. They go to the church. They go to their first group and they're like, I don't like it. Right? And it's like, that's okay.
Totally fine.
Every person, you don't meet every person and you go, we're going to be friends.
Right.
right?
Therapist, I say all the time, it's like trying on clothes. It's not all going to fit.
Yeah,
Like, you gotta
100%.
find
And
one you vibe
sometimes
with.
they don't fit over time, Ted.
And
You know what I'm saying?
that's true.
And we gotta change. Where like at
Yeah.
one point you were really serving me, right? And at this season it's time for me to move and go do this or be,
Yes.
you know, in a different group or do whatever. And that's okay too.
Yes.
Right.
Also, just for everybody out there too, and I think this is one thing it's very important for us to know as people who seek help and seek therapists. The therapist can also break it off with you
Yeah.
if they feel like you need a higher level of care or that something else can serve you better than they can.
Yeah.
And do not be discouraged by that either. That's
Yeah.
very normal and happens more than you'd think.
Yeah.
They are sworn on a book that if they know they can't serve you, they cannot continue to take your money.
Well, yeah, and I would say, for example, with that, right? There might be something like, for example, let's say if there's a chance, like let's say you have something going on with like your boyfriend or men in general in your life, right? And your therapist happens to be a man or whatever, and like they're very triggering to you right now.
Right.
They might send you to a different, something of care, right? Just because they understand that like right now at where you are, like you already have enough things that you're trying to process. And if I'm going to be sitting here constantly triggering you and putting you in fight or flight or whatever, you know, again, I might not be the best person to give you that care right now. And there's a time, like I even do this from, if you flesh it out just from like a leadership standpoint, right? I understand that I'm not always the person that needs to communicate this or that, right? Like it might need to come from somebody else and it might need to come in a different way, said in a different way from somebody in a different position. Because again, like, a lot of times it's not even the substance of like what's being said, but, again, one of my favorite, I actually need to go back and read that book. There's a book that I really enjoy, but I'm trying to think of the title right now. You know, I'm terrible at names. But there's a book and it talks about like one of the, thanks for the feedback. Thanks for the feedback. And I've quoted the book. I need to go back and read that one. A lot of times, again, it's just like who it's coming from.
Yeah.
You know, and because they could remind you of somebody in your life that challenged you or whatever. And again, it might not have anything. And this is where you like think about it. It's like, especially if you have a really good relationship with somebody. If you have a really good relationship with them, you can talk about things that you can't talk about. Like you can talk to me about things that no one else could talk to me about.
Sure.
You know what I'm saying? Joel can talk to me about things that like no one else can talk to me about just because of unique roles and like the relationships we have, the trust that's laid down, the foundation of years of relationship, all these other things. And like that's where like players, it's the same thing. It's like I can say things to them that no one else can say to them,
Right.
and that they might need to hear just because of my position, my role, and also the permission that they've given me to speak into them in that way. And so that opens up a thing. And I think when people don't recognize that and they're just shooting feedback from the hip, or like especially to like on social media or something like that, it's like,
Yeah.
like you giving comments on this other thing is like you know, again, especially you don't have an established relationship or any of these other things. We've created a whole new world where there's just so much feedback,
Right.
and I think that's a big piece. But I just wanted to touch on the first part of that, right, which is try multiple groups. Like
Yes.
the first one you go to, you might not really like, and also too, let's put it this way. Another thing might be that you feel uncomfortable because you're just having to be vulnerable. Just being out with other people in a group when you're not in the best emotional state, that's a big step for somebody. A lot of people want to be alone and isolate.
Yes.
So you might just feel uncomfortable because you're not used to being around other people when you're not feeling at your,
Yes.
your best, right? And
Or even the simplicity of, again, like I was saying before, saying things out loud.
yeah,
It's very uncomfortable to say things out loud that you've never said out loud before. And we don't even think about that on a day to day, like how uncomfortable it is to say things out loud in front of people, in front of one other person.
Yeah.
Especially who can be a stranger. I mean, sure, maybe they're your team's designated person and you've heard of them and you know they have good results and yada yada. But for you to sit in front of another human being and express some truth that has not yet been expressed, there is a lot of complexities that come with that. And that can be very uncomfortable, but there's still a lot of growth within that process.
Yeah. And that's where sometimes like I had to learn that too, because for me, it's a lot easier to share. You know, like I process things externally a lot more. So like groups and stuff like make a lot of sense to me. Like I want to be in groups. Like you could ask Jarrell, like half the time I go to get food, I want Jarrell to come with me. You know what I'm saying? It's just like, yes, we're processing, we're talking business and all those other things while we're going to do it. But also too, like, yes, there is times, like I said, every day, like I go back, I have my own time, I have my personal time, all those other things. But also too, like I process things a lot externally, right? So, which also makes me think about like why prayer should be good for me, like out loud too.
For sure.
Yeah, I was thinking about
well,
that.
and I think
like,
even an extra layer on top of that, there's also accountability
Yeah.
that comes with saying things out loud. And that was
sure.
something, you know, very quickly that I learned in college from two really great mentors that I had, one of which I led a women empowerment league with, and the other of which really guided me through motivational speaking. But both of them really believed in saying things out loud purely for accountability. If I share a goal with you, if I share something of a desire or maybe even something I'm ashamed of, if I say it out loud, I'm more likely to be held accountable to start, stop, or continue. Okay. And that's where I think, again, holds us back from saying things out loud because we actually don't want that accountability. And that's the extra layer.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that could be, again, a very interesting piece for, and again, I think that's why I also realized too how much, in a lot of ways, there's a lot of blessings like of how like my environments, and then also too even one thing, you know, I talked about this with like, you know, like my family, for example, is like my dad was very, you know, like you see, you know, like what you see is what you get, and like the, you know, on the same side of that, like very open, but like also on the same note, like there's a lot of things that I had to heal from all these other things, but one thing I was always very like, this is who I am, like, and I think that it's served me so well in the ability of, like you said, right, is like expressing some of these things out loud, and then obviously the accountability that comes along with that, also to help like advice and other things, people speaking back into me, and then also openness where I build community in a lot of things because I'm willing to be vulnerable. Like again, relationships being based off of, or depth of a relationship being based or needing a prerequisite of vulnerability. And so like that has also served me really well when it comes into relationships and some of those things. And then also, you know, openness, right, of other things, right? Like you're not guessing like what you think, you know, like where we're at or whatever those things are. Like we could just like talk.
Right.
But I also think about that as like, I know that in large, a lot, you know, other people, like, while this has been more, some of those things have been more innate, and yes, I've leaned into them more as I've gotten older for sure, but like more just like hardwired, like who I am. But I know for a lot of people, like I said, for a while, like I'm just like, for me, I'll be like what's, just say it, like what's going on, like, you know, like it's so for me, I'm like, you know, like how could you not want to, you know, like, but and that's where I've had to have compassion and also patience and all those other things of like letting people be where they're at, where like, you know, that one of the things for me, because it's so easy for me and because that's my natural like instinct is to do, is that one thing that can be hard for me is like pushing people and healing so much quicker than like needs to happen, or to a place that can be uncomfortable, is because like I'm like, well, let's talk, like let's process it, like let's do it right now. You know? And that's just not how.
Go out and hit a home run.
Yeah, just go out. Let's just like, you know, and I think that's like the thing as well. It's like especially for people that are hardwired more the opposite way, is it can be really hard. Like I know for example, like I'm thinking of someone particularly in our church group, right, where like they like to isolate. Like when things go bad, they you know, they remove themselves from everybody, right? And they're an internal processor. And then also too, but it takes them large periods of time to like get through, you know, processing, right? And I think that can be tough. And I was going to have you maybe open that up just because you have way different life experience than I will, in the sense of like who you've spoken with people that process like that, is that can be, I know that can be difficult for them because they're like, well, I process things internally, right? I this is how my healing process is. Like I need a lot of this time to do that. But then also too, I can feel like those people sometimes can have the problem of, well, they don't want to share. They don't have those communities. They're more prone to isolate, right?
Yeah.
And while that is how they internalize and they process, and while that can be true, and again, like we all need our alone time and all those things. I know that for this person specifically, and I'm thinking of in my head, that can also lead why they it can take longer, than maybe, generally the normal person would get over or through something because of that mentality or tendency, I guess I would say. So what advice would you say to like people like that, or that are more internal processors, or they're not, very extroverted, like they don't like to externally process. They don't, like all those other things, like kind of like, what is that? What are your kind of thoughts there?
Well, I like to think of isolation as being underwater, right? At some point, you have to come up for air. You can't stay underneath forever.
Yeah, I like that.
You have to come up for air, even if it's for a second.
Yeah.
Right? And now also, like, full disclosure, I talk to myself all the time. I obviously journal daily.
Yeah.
I talk to God daily, like, which can appear like I'm talking to myself to some, but
yeah, for sure.
I
was thinking about
would
that
be going in.
I was thinking about that the other day. It's like,
right.
I think I'm probably talking to myself.
Yeah, and I think if you're someone who isolates, which is totally fine.
Yeah.
However, find your things that utilize that time well. If I'm by myself, am I journaling? If I'm by myself, am I meditating? Am I spending time in prayer? Am I spending time with God? Am I spending time exploring myself?
Yeah.
Because I think it's very different, your intentional time, right? If your intentional time is spent with exploration, then great. But I still encourage that come up for air. Come up for air and talk to someone, a friend, a mentor, an advisor, whoever it may be. But I want to create that picture of, again, being underwater for a long time and feeling that desperation of breath.
Yeah.
You need that.
What do you, I just thought of something while you were talking. I was thinking about this, is obviously they're probably not listening to this podcast, but maybe give advice to someone that is listening to this podcast to help someone that's not listening to this podcast. Because I can slip into this at times, but I know people that live here. You get what I'm saying?
Sure.
Okay, so my thought is, I know to some, it might feel exhausting to have conversations like this, to self-explore, to be curious, all these other things. Like, you're thinking, it's not that deep. It's not that deep. It's not that, like those, like that live in there. It's not that deep. It's not that, but like I say this in my own life. I've come across videos where I'm like, maybe it's about God. Maybe it's something that requires some self-reflection or whatever, right? It's a post that actually has some depth to it, or whatever that is. That's going to be challenging. Maybe it might be reading. Maybe it might be doing something that improves your life, right?
Yep.
But it seems and it feels exhausting. And I've had moments where I slip into there and I'm like, curious about why I'm there, and I know, like, obviously it's probably not necessarily one answer, right?
Right.
But I'm thinking about, like, for that, I know that there's, like, for example, like I said, like a podcast like this might feel like, oh, I'm going to keep scrolling, or I'm going to go to the next podcast, or I'm going to do these other things because I'd rather just be entertained, right? And not go to the other place. Like, what do you kind of think about that of kind of tipping the scale into a place of, like, more like self-exploration maybe, or like even like curiosity, or like what that is, like, because I know I even slip into those places where, like, those conversations, like, just feel exhausting to even get going. And I know, like, you bring it up to that person and you want to, like, and they literally are just like, even you bringing it up is exhausting. Like, I just immediately lost, like, I don't even want to talk, about all this stuff. And they're, like, in their emotional space.
Yeah. Well, emotions are exhausting. Let's get that right off the bat, right? Emotions are so exhausting.
Yeah.
And again, I mean, as humans, we're having so many thoughts throughout the day. I mean, almost nonstop.
Yeah.
Right? And I was just listening to a podcast recently that was saying that 75% of those thoughts that the average human has are negative thoughts.
Yeah.
So now let's take that into account and talk about how exhausting 75% of your negative thoughts are.
Yeah.
Now I've asked you a question that probes you to think about 75% of those negative thoughts. Are you really inclined to have that conversation with me?
Yeah.
Right? So again, my biggest superpower that I can't speak enough about, awareness and mindfulness. I've spent so much time journaling and really tapping into different areas of how I can process the external world around me, where it's become very clear to me when I become fatigued. Right. And I get fatigued with just about everything. Let me just also, like, my life cardio is probably as real as my exercise cardio. It's not that great.
Yeah.
But it's because I'm exerting a lot of energy with everything that I do, because I pride myself on being very intentional.
Yeah.
And I think
And aware.
Yeah. I'm hyper aware, hyper vigilant. Okay. As my therapist would say. But with that, and I think this is a huge unlock for athletes also. While we're here, I'm going to come right out and flag this as something to kind of mark down for you listeners. But if you can become aware of when you're becoming emotionally fatigued, physically fatigued, mentally fatigued, that is an unlock in-game, post-game, pre-game, all the time.
Agreed.
If I know I'm going into a game and I'm tired and I'm sore and maybe I stayed up a little too late, or maybe, you know, I actually got hurt and I'm trying to play anyway, I'm going to have to move a little different. And even vice versa. If I'm coming in fresh, I'm hot, I'm motivated, I'm ready to rock, I'm also coming in different. But it's how to utilize your head space, your heart space, your body space, your physical being in those different ways, because you're not going to be on all the time.
Yeah.
You're just not. Nobody is. And I think one thing that has really helped me unlock those areas is, of course, journaling. But sitting in that fatigue when it arrives. So almost welcome it in. Come on down and feel what it feels like and try to do what you need to do. Know what you have to do and when you need to do it, and know where you're at.
Yeah.
Because if I can locate that roadmap, if I can make a blueprint of what that actually looks like, I can utilize the car better. I can drive the car much better.
Yeah. I was and to add to that, I think a thing for me and like how I do that is, I think it's also good to do some things that I don't want to do. Right. But like you said, I'm very aware. So like, for example, if I really don't feel like reading, but I know I need to read, I'll tell myself, well, I'm going to do it even for 5 minutes. I don't want to do it, but I'm going to read for 5 minutes. Now, when I really want to read, maybe I'm going to read for a couple hours.
Yeah.
Or whatever, right?
Yeah,
And that's
break out
okay
the
too.
highlighters, go to town.
Yeah, let's get it, right? But like, for example, my Bible, there's plenty of times I don't feel like it's late at night and my brain's winding down, like all these other things. And like, there's plenty of times again, and you can mark me as like, some people always think it's just like that. I always like, a large part of the time I'm like, I know that it feeds my soul and it's really serving for me. Like, yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
But with that being said, there's plenty of times when I don't want to read my Bible, right? And then I'm like, my brain kicks on and goes, yeah, but that's not a good idea.
Yeah, and also the Bible app will read to you.
Yes.
Hello.
Yes. But that's what I think in that same space where I'll go again, like I'm gonna read my Bible for 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Like even if I read a single verse, even whatever, and then a lot of times I get into it and I end up reading more than in the first place. But I do think like with that, right, is like that balance between the two of being like, obviously I'm not just getting pushed around by my feelings and just like whatever I feel like doing, I'm doing. And like there is things that like I need to do, but I also might be able to manage that by having that mindset around, like I'm going to do at least a little bit of it. Yeah. And then I even apply this over into other things, right? Like, okay, so like when I had Christmas decorations up, right? And I'm like, all right, I got to take mentally. I'm just fatigued, and I'm like, I got to take down all these Christmas recommendations. I mean, these decorations.
Yeah.
And one thing that's really helped me, or like cleaning the house or something like that.
Yeah.
It's just being like, what small thing could you do right now? Mm-hmm. What's one thing you could do right now? Yes, it's maybe not the whole thing, but just because sometimes I won't even get started.
Yeah.
Where if I just get started, like what's the smallest thing? Like I had all the stockings like pinned to the wall, right? It takes me 2 seconds to take the stockings down. Okay, let me do that.
Yep.
All right, let me take down this light. Let me pack this one thing up.
Yeah.
Right. And I think sometimes with that, it's like we always think about completing the full task. Right. When in reality, it might just be like, if you just get started, like if you just give it 2 minutes. I get it. You don't have an hour. You don't have the capacity to do an hour right now. But what do you have the capacity? Could you even even if you don't feel like you have the capacity, you most likely have the capacity to read for 5 minutes.
For sure.
You get what I'm saying? Like you're not that empty. You're just really low. Like your gas is low or whatever. Like you're for sure low. But it's just like, again, just read, like pushing yourself to do those things or being, again, we've had people that come to community group and like they only stay for part of the experience.
Yeah.
Right. And then leave or whatever. Right. But it's like, I think sometimes like with that, it's the same thing, right? It's like either all in or don't start. Mm-hmm. But in reality though, and like is taking those little steps and even just starting and just doing a little bit of it. Like what little thing could I do towards that goal? What little small thing, even if it's the smallest thing. And just like John Maxwell talks about it, like the law of momentum, right? And that's like just building momentum, right? And just a little bit. And then all of a sudden these other things start becoming big. Obviously you can take that in the fitness and your physical side and like all these things I think is huge and can be, super helpful too.
Definitely. Yeah. There's just simply like the power of micro goals. I mean, there's plenty of, if you just Google micro goals, you'll see tons of things, and 10 out of 10 recommend trying to create your own micro goals.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think obviously there's a visual, you posted it before, I posted it before, is like the ladders, right? You see the 2 ladders on the wall, and basically if you had a ladder, like let's say it's a 20-foot high ladder and like you only had a notch like every 5 feet or something like that. It's like, it's just so far away that like, yes, it's a ladder, but the goals are way too set apart where you have, obviously a ladder where you have steps, right? Where you can take these things, and we just think that we're going to sometimes, the problem is we set huge goals, right? Which are awesome, but they don't give us a lot of feedback until we finally hit that major goal that probably takes months, years, whatever that is to get to. And in the meantime, again, like there's not any actual steps in between. And it also could be very discouraging because it's like, if I don't achieve the macro goal, then am I a failure, blah, blah, blah. Or does this even, is it, again, am I on path, and then you start going into worth and like all these other things that people get entangled with. And, or we get entangled with. And so I think the other big part with that, and then we go into, again, like those micro goals are huge. And I also think on the other side of that, right, is biblically it says, like the world cheers for us when we complete the macro, right? Like everybody cheers the macro completion, right? Or, they may achieve, right? You feel good, have all these other things.
Sure.
But biblically it says like, God's excited just, and cheers just to see the work begin. Right. And so, and really in reality, I've seen that, right? It's just like, like that's actually the most exciting thing is like most people just never start. Like, and the power of that. Most people, like literally just like taking that in, like most people just never start.
Right.
Like, great. We're thinking about the big goal and like people quitting and all these other things, but it really is something to be acknowledged when just the start, because especially on the things that are actually important.
Right. We
love to start things that are not that impactful. We love to start things that are, smaller or that make us feel comfortable or these other things, but like when it's the hard thing, the thing that is emotionally very triggering for us or overwhelming or like a big step of something like a new season, a new whatever, it's like some people struggle just to get off the starting block of there. You know what I'm saying? Like even start to even just take the first step of making those things happen. And I also think about that of like, so this one, we were just talking about being vulnerable. I'll be vulnerable with everybody, right? So for example, I remember I told Jarrell this is, so I went through a breakup like a year ago, right? And at the time, one of the things like at the end was one, I'm not like jumping for joy. I don't think anybody jumps for joy of like doing dishes. Like it doesn't like jump for joy. Like that's not my favorite thing to do, obviously. But with that being said, because there was some emotional attachment that had to do with like kind of like roles and like what we're doing, all these underlying things. What I told Jarrell is like there was like 2 particular dishes in my sink that I didn't clean for months because it had an emotional attachment to me. It had nothing to do with the dishes at that point, right? I had cleaned other dishes, I had done other things, but these 2 particularly, I had realized, I was telling Jarrell, like I wouldn't even start to do them because there was like this healing, and I knew when I actually did it, obviously it didn't take me very long. Like, it wasn't something that was big, but for me, and again, that great for me, it's and I wanted to use that example because it is the dishes. It's a small thing that can lead to so many other things of healing, but I couldn't get to them because emotionally I didn't feel like, like at the time, like it felt like such a big deal emotionally, even underlying. Like I had to give some awareness, all these other things of being like, and me and Jarrell were talking about is like, I know it doesn't have anything to do with the dishes. I could splash some water in here and throw them in the dishwasher and be done in 10 minutes. But I sat here for months, right? Because emotionally, I'm not ready to clean these dishes.
Right.
Right. Which is silly because you would think it's just dishes. Right. But, and I bring that up, to me in my life, it was dishes. Some people, it's starting to work out. Some people, it's eating this food. Some people, it's going to that group. Some people, it's something to a lot of other people is so little. It's getting that new car, applying for that, quitting your job, like all these other things and starting that new job, starting that hobby, doing that other things. And like some of those, there might be bigger steps in there, but also at the same time, like, for example, like some people are like quitting my job, like that's a big deal. People quit their job every day. Millions of people every day. People start new jobs every day. Yeah. Millions of people. Yeah. Right. I've quit jobs like this. You know what I'm saying? Like, some people that's really easy. Some people, again, for example, like those dishes would have been done day one and they would have not had that attachment, all that stuff. It's big, whatever. But I use that as an example where it's like when I actually got going, right? And I pushed through this storm, this monster that I've made it to be. And I just take one little step. Then also too, sometimes the facade of the monster falls down because you actually challenged what was really there. And yes, I gave myself time to heal. Like again, it wasn't there's all of that context too, for sure. But my point is that sometimes we've spent so much time on the problem that we know every detail about the problem. We are in bed with the problem. We know every reason why. Everything that holds us back. We've seen it from a million angles, right? We've evaluated, we've reflected a billion days, but we're stuck because we haven't taken a single inch of just a little bit of like, what's the smallest thing I can move? Like the smallest step that I can take. And I think like even like with that is like when it comes into healing like that, right? It's just like just the smallest step sometimes, right, can dismantle what thinking could never do. You know what I'm saying? Like in that sense, like we need to move to perceive, and we also need to perceive to move. It's like the same thing with like movement in the cage, but the same thing with it is like your perception changes dramatically if you just alter your location just a little bit, Like sometimes we just don't want to move. We get locked in that one space and we're just seeing everything from this one angle. And it's just like, if you just take one step that way, if you just serve one day, if you just go to community one day, like you don't know what that opens up. Like you don't know how much, like all of a sudden it's like, sometimes I even think about that, like with, again, like cleaning or something like that, right? It's just like, you just get going and you just do it. And it's just like, oh, it just wasn't that bad. Or like even too, like you can, if I can connect it to something even smaller, maybe it's like working out, right? Like, and you're like, oh, that's a whole workout, all these things. It's like, yeah, but like, as soon as you just get moving a little bit, like, you know what I'm saying? As soon as you just do your first, like, all right, I'm just going to go there. Even if you have to tell yourself, and I'm telling you, even if it is these 10 minutes, if you're going to say, I'm going to drive to the gym, I'm going to park in the parking lot for 5 minutes and drive home. Good start. Just start. Don't matter. It don't matter. It don't matter what that step is. However small you need to make it. Show up to the community group, park outside, and leave. Sit in the parking lot and listen to a song, whatever. However small you need to make it. Whatever your little micro step needs to be. The important, I think it goes back to this, is like long time ago, one of our friends used to always say, you know, again, stagnant water is poisonous. You just got to move. You know, and I think that I don't know who needs to hear that, right? But that thing is just like, you just got to move.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Yeah. Doesn't mean that you got to do the whole thing right now.
Right.
Don't mean you got to, be able to run 30 miles right now. Right. But like, put the running clothes on, get up in the morning at that time.
Yeah.
You could even go back to bed, whatever, right? Pick the smallest step. Wake up when you're supposed to wake up, right? Like, just get moving. Maybe you don't have to run today. Just start waking up at that time.
Right.
Just like the smallest thing. Sometimes we think that we're thinking small enough, but sometimes if we're not moving, then we're not thinking small enough. If we get into that micro, just getting moving, a lot of times, like, again, we're having to deal with so much stuff because we're just sitting in the poison. We're just not moving. We're just sitting in and again, there is a time and a place. There's a season to sit here and grieve and all that stuff. But one of the parts of healing is like, we got to take a step. You got to take a step, and it could be the smallest of steps. But I think that's also a big thing. It's just like, just that little step, and like what healing that can bring from the other way as well, right? It's like, again, if we just sit in the same spot over and over again, right? If I'm just sitting here and like, I just got this visual of me sitting on the ground and there's like a conveyor belt and there's like bricks falling and they're just hitting me in the head. And I'm like, that really hurt. And I'm sitting there talking about how much it hurt to get hit in the head by the brick. And here comes another brick. It's just, I'm like, that one really hurt. It's just like, bro, if you just move 1 foot to the left, like you just stop getting hit in the head, you could worry about the other bricks that hit you in the head and like heal from that, rather than just sitting here and just getting hit by bricks over and over again. It's just like, we just need to take a little step. And swear to you, like, this healing journey will be way better. Just get out of that same position. Just get out of that friend group. Or even just spend a little less time with them, or even just give yourself a little bit more alone time, or just start the journal, or like, again, just a little. What's the smallest thing when I don't feel like moving? Just thinking about what is the smallest thing, because not moving is way more painful. It seems like emotionally it feels more comfortable, but in macro, it's gonna hold me in this place. So like I think that thing is just like, you can be a drip. You can slowly, you can just slowly alter just a little bit of water, right? But just like keep the water moving.
For sure.
As soon as the water stops moving and becomes stagnant, it gets poisonous. Like, if you just have flowing water, right? Even if it's the slowest of streams or all the things, like, that water is way, way, because again, I'm always went the science route, but again, moving water is generally healthier, right? And large, right? Like, it's like, again, even if it's the slowest stream, like, let the water keep moving rather than, as soon as it gets stagnant, like, things get crazy.
Yeah. We just have to talk about it for 1 second, but, and this particularly falls in the minds of athletes in all sports.
Yeah.
But let's just bring awareness to how many of us have given so much power to inanimate objects. I know that there's someone out there who hasn't washed their jerseys probably since last season.
No, there's a jersey on somebody's wall that's just...
There's a jersey, yes, that has never been washed. And it might even be from the 60s. Listen, I can tell you right now, my dad still has his wrestling singlets, probably from the 90s when he tried out for the Olympic trials, that has never been cleaned. And that is disgusting. I'm going to come out and say it. It's gross. Wash your clothes. But think about how much power athletes give your jersey, your glove, your shoes, your number. God forbid you go to a different school and you can't get your number.
Yeah, I've had that happen multiple times.
And
the coach was wearing my number. Rough.
My
God, I ain't getting that number, bruh. The coach's number.
Somebody else got your number. And again, like you said, it's just these little glimpses and these little snippets of being a little uncomfortable, exploring something new, bringing something else to awareness, hitting the root to why you gave that inanimate object so much power in the first place. Is it really because you didn't wash your jersey that you went 4 for 4? Or was there something else? And look, mystery, let live. Okay? We will never know.
Baseball players are very
we will never know. Your socks, your stirrups, all the things.
Yeah.
You know, but when you think about that, it should really shed light on how wild our emotions can be. Because really those are things that, are sentimental, emotionally driven, right? There's no fact that says if you don't clean your jersey, you're going to perform better, right? But we will let our emotions fuel that and we'll run with that. And so that alone should bring us just a little bit of awareness to how wild our emotions can be and how far they can take us.
And again, and if we're attaching to objects like that, imagine how a lot of people are also attaching to people like that.
1,000%. And the power you've given the dishes is probably minute compared to the power you gave that person.
For sure.
And same thing. The thieves stole it when they broke in, but I had this bracelet and it was a boxing bracelet. It was something my dad gave me years ago. I had it forever. And it was something, again, like held sentimental value. I'd put it in, a floor front of wherever, my offices were. And I think one of the bigger things when my sentimental items went missing was even mentally earthquaking, we'll call it, because visually I didn't have my little pieces of comfort. And I think that's what we create a lot of times as well, especially athletes, is we create our little world of comfort. And the moment our little pieces of comfort start to disappear, we get very frazzled. And I think for those of us, like you talk about all the time, is being able to adapt. When you can adapt, when your places of comfort disappear, again, just another unlock.
Well, I think also too, it brings in obviously the question of like, where are you holding your comfort? And I think that's if it's in objects, people, things, which is also awareness, right? Even like people's opinions. Michael Todd did that series where it's like, cuff to, or called Cuffed, but it's like, cuff to the comments, cuff to affirmation or, things like that, right? And just like cuff to, people or food, like, all these things where we run to these vices, these support systems of like what it is. And I think it's interesting, especially when you stay in your bubble and you don't venture out very often, you don't realize that you are leaning on these things so much. That's why when they get taken away, you're like, whoa, like it's like you lost your leg. You didn't even realize that you're putting so much weight on that leg or that person or that thing until it's taken away. And that's why I also think the process of I think it could be very useful. We talk about fasting, obviously, from like food and all these other things, but also fasting people, things, situations, environments. Again, like it's okay. Like don't go out one weekend. Don't hang out with that person for a week. Don't talk to them for a couple days. Like, and especially if it's, and for some people like, that's normal. I don't talk to these people for weeks at a time or whatever. But if there is people that you talk to every day that like, you might not realize how much weight like, and it's actually really, I think, can be really good for the relationship, because you might be putting weight, and which would therefore on my side almost like pressure on this relationship or that person to show up in a certain way for you, because you're leaning on them so much and you're not even realizing how much you're leaning on them, or you feel like there's no other way to support without. Right. And so removing them even for shorter periods of time can also, it's like you can also wean off of whatever that is, right? Like it could be a substance, it could be a person, it could be a, whatever that thing is for you. It could be sport, it could be an object, it could be, whatever those things are. And just like us understanding is that another way of thinking about it, and this is where I've learned from the biblical standpoint of like denying myself, is I'm a slave to that object or that person or those things. What that person thinks about me is now made me a slave. My emotions are a slave.
Yep.
And that's a different way of like motivating me to like go a different way. It's like, I'm a slave to this object. Like I'm a slave. I'm acting a different way because of what this object, this person, this, this, environment, this, group, whatever, what they think, or I'm starting to in some way idolize or put weight behind it that it doesn't deserve, when in reality it's a tool, right? Like it's a tool. It is something that I should love and be thankful for and all these other things. But also at the same time, like when I start putting identity in a lot of those things, it's like being mindful of that too as well, because like, again, one, it just doesn't deserve that honor, right? Like, no object deserves that honor, obviously, too. Even people, like, you got to remember, like, it sounds good to be like, oh, like, again, the same thing, like, Tara, my best friend, like all these other things, like, yes, it emotionally, hurt me if anything, happened, blah, blah, blah. But also at the same time, I think there is also a more beautiful, a deeper level of relationship to be like, I don't need you to be anything. You get what I'm saying? Like wherever you're at, whatever season you're in, no matter how whatever kind of way you go, or what's important in your life, or what you're doing right now, or whatever you're, all those other things, is it helps create healthy boundaries. It helps, establish all these other things that are just like really good within, relationship, comparatively to like, well, if I'm putting all this weight and I'm depending on it to be this exact way and all these other things, well, it's like, well, that's not fair, because you're also caging in that other person to be a certain person, or to an object to do a certain thing, or to be a certain way, or a community group to respond a certain way. And the moment it doesn't, your world's going to come crumbling, because you're putting all those weight and support that you're pulling from these things, right? And there's definitely time and a place where like I get it, right? Like there's a time where like we do need support, and we do need these other things, and like there's nothing wrong with that, but keeping in mind at the same time that like not making a I could go the vanity route, but I'm more meaning like a temporary structure, a permanent structure. Where like, hey, this helps me get through this season. And like right now, like there's all these other things I get pulled away, and like I'm doing these other things. But like, when we talk about that too, is like I almost think about it when you're coming off of like certain drugs and stuff like that. Like, great, I'm taking this other, to wean me off to do this, but this is not supposed to be a permanent space. Yeah. I'm not supposed to stay here. Right. This is just to get me somewhere else. And too often we end up getting stuck there. And we get stuck in this environment that's supposed to get me to somewhere else. Like, and I need to stay here, or again, the substance or whatever this is, right? That like I get stuck in that thing that was supposed to, what was supposed to be a transition became a house. And like, I'm not supposed to sleep here. This is where I work. This is my home. You know what I'm saying? Like this is my friend, but also too, like, not my God, right? And like, and this is a place of transition that helps me get from place to place, but is not somewhere where I bear down and like, make my castle. That could be big, but
for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, even going back to our main root, I think we should all kind of come to the realization that college is a place of transition.
Woo!
Okay.
Change.
You're not going to be in college forever.
No.
Now, do I know people that spent 7-10 years in
Hey,
college
6.
being a
What's up?
student? 100%.
Should be a doctor.
But yeah. But the reality of college is that it is a transitional phase. It is
And be there
just
while you're
the
there.
stairs
Yeah.
to your next stage.
Yep.
In the moment let that hit for a second.
It's hard. It's hard too because we're not built to do that. You know what I'm saying? We're not built. Yes, now we can travel around the world and we can do all these other things, but like in reality, like when we're kind of like it's one place. Like we're not meant to be disconnected from one another. We're built to build these deeper relationships and like all these other things.
Yeah.
And college is a tricky time, especially because you're like 19 or whatever, right?
Especially when you're about to leave.
Oh, just don't-
Especially when it's your senior year, your last season.
Well, I'm just thinking also too on the other side, people are graduating every year
Yep.
that you had relationships with
Yep.
in this exact environment, and then their life is going on to a different stage, and all these other things are happening. And then for me, I'm going from state to state. I'm going to a different school, and all these other things. Like
Yep.
these relationships are rapidly changing. My world is rapidly changing, and so. Again, along with that, again, like, man, I think about that all the time. Like when I was 19, 20, like all that stuff, like, like life was rough, right? Just emotionally, because I obviously didn't have the tools yet. I obviously, again, these things were all being developed, all this stuff. And then also your environment. And again, I, didn't have God in my life at the time. I'm leaning on so many things, and those things are rapidly changing all the time.
Yeah.
So if my foundation is rapidly fluctuating, I'm rapidly fluctuating,
Yeah.
and because of where I was at my time. So I know that, again, that might not, some people that feels like, bro, that's exactly how I feel. And then other people being like, well, again, they might have a different foundation more set, and hopefully you do. Again, like I didn't as much at the time. Or it's sometimes people are going to college, but they're staying home.
Yeah.
Right? Like you stayed here and you had your family still around, like a lot of your friends, like all these other things where like, how, like I'm like across the country, and really tough crime areas and like, all of these things. And it's just like, this was like like there was some things where like I couldn't lean on these things, which is also a blessing, because they were getting pulled away from me so rapidly, and it kept happening over and over and over again, where I was like, oh, I can't lean on these things. Because if I lean on these things, like I know that gets taken away very often. Right, my world gets reestablished over and over and over again.
Yeah.
Right, which is cool, because I felt like it led me to more sturdy foundation, because I couldn't lean on those other things as well. Right. Probably also some trauma, but it's like, again, it's on me. It's on me, Tay. I can't lean on nobody. I got to do it myself. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
I can think it could be huge, but yeah, it's a tough time being at that age. I think it's just having compassion for people that are going through a lot of that, right? As coaches, most of us are coaching through that stage. High school's not great, not great either, right? Like also not a fun time. People are mean.
No.
Yeah, like high school, college, all those things. Like, again, I was mean. Like, high school and college, like there was plenty of times like your boy should have way more grace, compassion, or self-awareness, all these other things, right? Like as well. And again, also too with like phones and all that stuff, where people just bring the bullying home with them and like all this other things, like it's tough to be. So I think it's just a reminder. I like when I talk to the athletes and the kid that age, is for me, I actually go back mentally. I'll go back into those spaces when I was that young, not for me being 30 years old and going like, oh, this is how I would handle it. Like, yeah, they're not 30 years old. Right. So having that other perspective of being like, man, like I remember, like, again, I think the key word there, and I know that it was in the sermon last week, and maybe that's why it's hitting me so much, is like the compassion of being like, to be them in their shoes at that age. There's a lot of rapid changes, right? That are just, it's a tough time of transition, which is, in anybody's time of transition is difficult, right? And so helping them navigate through that, being some, steadiness for them, consistent voice, some of those other things can be very helpful when everything else is, there's so much change, is like having some pieces of consistency and also some help with some mentorship of like where to point and like where to lean, and some of those things can be super useful.
As we've had the the opportunity to meet so many great coaches. I know I've met coaches in so many different sports, but I think where, and I'll leave our coaches, our coach listeners out there with this, is that really take some pride and take some ownership in how you can lead your athletes to what comes after the transition. How can you lead them as a human in everyday life? And how can you show them what comes next when athletics are over? It's Nate. Hi. You got something that came back for me? Oh, yep, that's it. Small day. All right. Thanks, Nate.
I love how it turned back on just for yours.
How about that?
Classic. Okay. Yeah. All right. Yeah, no, big time in players' lives, and like you said, speaking to like the bigger picture, like don't get sucked into like what's happening right there in their lives, but obviously, bigger picture of what's going on. So, yeah, let me pray us out.
All right.
Get going. All right. Dear Father, thank you so much, God, just for this time that we get to spend. And God, just let us, soften our hearts and open us up to our real foundation, God, and just being able to lean on you in all situations and be able to run to you at all times, God, and just know that everything that you bring us is a blessing, is protection, as guidance, and also too that it comes from you, God, and that you are our source. And we just pray that you continue to open our hearts and that you continue to widen our perspectives and help us develop deeper compassion for one another, and that people are not the problem but our purpose. And we just pray all these things in Jesus' mighty name. Amen.
Amen.
Well, until next time, Farm System out.